All right, everyone. Good morning. My name is Jeanette Siddiqui. I'll be moderating and I will get out of your way as quick as possible. Kate, go ahead and take it away.
Yeah, hi everyone, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm Kate Ebrill. I'm not technical, clearly by that display that I needed a bunch of people to help me get this up, but it did take a bunch, not just one, so it clearly wasn't just me. I'm the interoperability lead within CSIRO, which is Australia's national science agency, and I'm part of the Australian eHealth Research Centre, which is the national digital health program within that science agency. So I'm going to go on the Wayback Machine and take you back to 2016 before I take you to where we are now. So way back in 2016, we had been as a country 10 years into our journey around the implementation of SNOMED CT. We were 4 years into our journey of our National Electronic Health Record, which at that time was full of a lot of documents and not a lot of data and not a lot of structured data. And the CEO of the organization at the time gave the challenge to myself, and Dion is in the front row, who is technical, so any technical questions to him. To say, come on, guys, you've got to get SNOMED adopted and you've got to get SNOMED adopted now. And we're like, well, what can we do about this challenge? SNOMED is a beautiful thing. It's very rich. It really supports what we need to do in terms of semantics around electronic health record, derives a whole lot of benefits, but we needed to get it adopted and we needed to get it adopted right. There was a lot of implementation and there was a lot of bad implementation. So our goal was, what can we actually do to actually improve the adoption of SNOMED in our country, improve the richness of the clinical information? And to do that, we actually went and spoke to industry. And we said, what are the challenges? What are the barriers? And we're like, what can we actually do to remove the effort for our implementers around adopting SNOMED? But importantly, when we go and talk to our implementers, it's not just about SNOMED. So yes, SNOMED is our national reference terminology, but LOINC is used extensively within our laboratory systems. We had a lot of other existing code systems across the country. So we needed to provide a solution that not only supported really good, meaningful adoption of SNOMED, but we needed to remove the barriers for our implementers to support the adoption of all of their terminology and code systems. So we said, right, how can we simplify that use by addressing these challenges faced by implementers? How can we encourage the adoption of standardized terminology by kind of giving them a way to support their own needs first? So solve our problem by helping them solve their problems, create a one-stop shop for national specifications, code systems, and enable that ability for others to create their own one-stop shop. Really importantly, improve that collaboration and really grow a community of people around adopting terminology within our country. And, you know, we've learned that through the FHIR community, that this really is the way to start to drive adoption and really start to realize those benefits of which we've all built these business cases around. We really wanted to get to seamless interoperability and enhanced reporting and advanced analytics. So we stood up this national service in Australia back in 2016. The guys convinced me, because as I said, not technical, the guys convinced me and said, hey, Kate, there's this thing called FHIR. You know Graham. Why not get FHIR Terminology Services a go and actually use that as the API for this national service? I remember talking to a bunch of people around the world, and they laughed at Dion and I when we said we were going to stand up this national piece of infrastructure. We were going to use the FHIR Terminology Services API. We were going to create this national service. And importantly, we were going to enable syndication so that anyone else in the country could also stand up their own service. And what we really wanted to do was support a bunch of common use cases. We wanted to, you know, really make that national content available through an API and through syndication. We wanted to give people tools where they could author their own code systems, value sets, and concept maps. We wanted to make sure that people could adopt and realize all the beauty of SNOMED without taking all the pain of RF2. And we wanted to make it so that vendors could actually focus their effort around the cool features in their product, not just try and manage terminology within their product. We also saw lots of bad implementations of SNOMED out there where clinicians had return searches in alphabetical order, they were made to walk the tree in the hierarchy. So how could we actually deliver a tool that enabled really fast performant Google-like search for clinicians? So doing the right thing became the easiest thing for clinicians. And then we also wanted to support really performant runtime use around supporting advanced use around decision support subsumption. So, you know, but on the other side, FHIR was really starting to take off in our country, and we really wanted to support information modeling and specification development at our national level. We wanted to be able to support validation of terminology content, importantly, support validation and translation in EHRs. And then again, that outcome we're aiming for, how can we actually support advanced analytics? You know, I go from the business side to those more use cases. On the FHIR side, more technical side, really it's about how do I support data entry, quickly find the right code, validation, is this code valid? Tell me about this code, find me in mapping, find me a code that's related to this other code, you know, analytics, so on. And as I said, talk to Dion about the technical stuff. And importantly, for where we were in Australia, and this is really similar for other organizations, countries around the world, Australia is a federation. While we wanted to stand up something at a national level, we have states and territories. And if you've got regions or provinces or other, you know, devolved nations, if you're in the UK, it's really important when you're looking at these services around supporting local autonomy and local governance and providing national availability, but also at a regional level, making that available. And the benefit for the implementers is regardless of whether they're connecting to a national service or a province service, they're using one API and the vendor has to learn one API. And that's, I think, a really great thing is regardless of the code system, regardless of which regional level, if we can start to drive people around to FHIR Terminology Services, we really are making it easier for implementers to get the code systems right the first time. So we wanted to create a federated ecosystem that would support that in Australia, where we could have a national terminology service. Each state and territory could stand up their own terminology service if they wished, and each organization could stand up their own within that as well. And that, you know, you could point to multiple terminology services for syndication. And what we've seen since 2016, when everyone laughed at Dion and I and said, you guys are crazy, you cannot do this at a national level, you're not going to stand up this at a production, and, you know, if anyone laughs at us, we'll take them on and do it. There is now massive increasing of implementations globally. And, you know, I'm only talking about the ones that I know of, those that are using Onto Server, which is the product that Cyro developed, but we know there's way more than this and other products out there. It's not just about Onto Server. This is really showing the demonstration of FHIR Terminology Services. So there are over 100 licensees that we know of that are now doing this globally. Onto Server is being used as the national service within Australia and New Zealand. Indonesia's just coming on board, England, Scotland, Wales. In Netherlands, 2 years ago, Nick just stood up Onto Server as a national terminology server here in the Netherlands. And so, you know, that's really starting to make available this content around the world, but one API the vendors have to learn. And really from a multinational viewpoint, it means our vendors globally have one way to connect. Why the increase? Really significant increase in global investment, as we all know. Also increasing use of FHIR, which we in this community all know. But importantly, we've also got people in the open air and OMOP community actively working with us as well. And how do they use FHIR Terminology Services to solve their terminology needs? And we're obviously moving from kind of sharing of information, which was what our electronic health record was about, to much more meaningful use of that information. We're also seeing an increasing number of SNOMED CT member countries. And what's really interesting is everyone's learnt from the pain in Australia that we went through of 10 years of hard slog before we jumped to FHIR Terminology Services. All the new countries on board, we're finding them go straight to kind of getting their SNOMED license and standing up a FHIR Terminology server at the same time. In terms of implementation patterns, and I won't go into a lot of detail about this, but we can talk more later, is what we're seeing is different countries are doing different models. So this is very similar to in the Netherlands. They've said, right, we're going to stand up a terminology server. We're going to make our content available via the API access, more design time, not necessarily runtime. Other countries like New Zealand have said, right, we're going to stand up our national terminology server to make all of our content available through those APIs. But actually, we're going to stand up a read-only service that's more performant, because we think there are some applications in our country, some programs that actually we want to expose that so our vendors can use that runtime and hit that national server runtime, which is fantastic if you're in those countries that want to be able to, you know, hook into that and take that. Within the NHS, similarly, they've gone, we're actually going to stand up a scaled instance and really make it available to the same level of the spine. And we're treating this as the same clinical kind of application as the applications running in the spine. And we're going to have platinum grade support around it. It's going to be available 24/7. And it's really there where one, access, but two, where they've got applications like the NHS app or startups and other organizations, really enabling them to be able to leverage that straight off the bat. Whereas for trusts, large organizations saying, you might want to think about your own way to handle this. I could go into a whole lot more detail, but I've got running out of time. So really the benefits to implementers are, as I said, having all these resources in one space via services, via APIs. And the other benefit is as we start to get that uptake and that increasing use and availability of standardized terminology, then you've got less mapping and translation effort on your side. So like lift the whole community up, one API access to deal with that. Where we've got countries at that national level standing up these services and enabling startups and new vendors to come in and start to leverage these APIs, then as new entrants are coming to the market, they're starting off the right way. They're not having to deal with the legacy that all the rest of us had to deal with around terminology and code system management. Really growing that community, because the more people using FHIR terminology services, again, leveraging the benefit of the community, more people to learn from, more to share the pain, and increasing data quality overall is actually going to lead to much more innovation, much more ability to support advanced use cases, decision support. Access to our public endpoint. So anyone want to go and text out FHIR terminology services for themselves, and access to all of our documentation. Really, that was a whirlwind. I'm so really happy to answer any more questions around our lessons learned over the last 7 years now, and lessons learned around kind of what's happening around the world. And as I said, any technical questions, Dion is also very happy to answer. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kate. Are there any questions from the room? Oh, one up here.
So you were talking about building an ecosystem of terminology services, and how do you build this, and what kind of ecosystem services are available that puts this together into an ecosystem?
Yeah, I think what's certainly what's happened in Australia and what we're now seeing in the UK is where they've stood up that national terminology server, and each of those regions are really standing up their own terminology servers and being able to connect between them and support that. So really, it's both the syndication feed that we've built into Onto server that enables that ecosystem to work. And two, it's really those strategies that those countries are running with to do that. So what's happening in the UK right now is that the NHS stood up the National Terminology Server for across the UK, and Scotland and Wales have now come on to start to build that into their own ecosystem. There's now trusts within the UK that are now standing up their own FHIR terminology service so that they can syndicate content, all using that same API. In Australia, we have about 90 people with an Onto server license, and then other people will be using their other products that are basically being able to connect. So having that ability for that national content, where the vision is, where we would love to see it go, and I know NHS looks at this as well, is really how do you create a discovery service to really encourage people to say, okay, they've got a bunch of concept maps and value sets over there. I don't have to reinvent the wheel. How can I leverage that? So we're kicking off a project kind of along those lines with the Australian Research Data Commons, which is the research organisation in Australia with a bunch of universities, where they're going to be standing up kind of that to say, sure, there's the national content, but here's all the stuff that the research community uses. Here's things that you can discover. So we know the provenance of them. We can discover them. We can use them at our own risk. But, people start using them, put the sunlight on them, and quality improves. And then you might say, well, actually, let's lift that up. So that's really where I would love to see it go. And I know UK is looking at something similar around kind of a national value set kind of authoring capability to do the same thing. And that's where we can kind of reduce a lot of the effort and again, improve the quality.
Can you speak to any of the kind of community capacity building that surrounds this work to get syndicates up and running with their own instances? And
this is how the guys convinced me that FHIR was the way. So when we started the project back in 2015, 16, and the guy said, hey, we're going to use the FHIR Terminology Services API, and hey, we're going to do the connectathon approach. What we did is we said, right, day one, we're going to start building the system. We're going to build it with a connectathon approach through it. So we stood up had our first connectathon. I was token female at that time in the room. So great to see that's not anymore in this global community. And we had 60 or 70 people come along, which for a country size of Australia, it's pretty good. And most of them said, day one, I know nothing about SNOMED, I know nothing about FHIR. We went through the connectathon approach. We had a bunch of experts in the room. At the end of day two, vendors stood up and said, I've just built this referral form that's just hitting, using FHIR questionnaires, some open source stuff that Brian had created. And now I'm actually hitting the terminology server to pull down a SNOMED value set. You know what? I was going to go and build my own proprietary code list because I thought SNOMED was too hard. And so what we did was we kept that approach up. So as we built the system over 6 months, we did 3 connectathons. When we went live, we had our vendors registered live and connecting to the service from day one. And then we really tried to keep that connectathon approach up over the next 2 years post that time to really continue that input. Now we kind of make sure that every connectathon we run through HL7AU, we still have terminology people in the room encouraging use of it. So there's about 1,300 people registered in Australia to use it. I've said about 90 people, like 90 organizations with their own licenses to use it. And we're doing that similarly in other countries, like Dion and I, and we've conned Graham to come with us, heading to Scotland on Monday and Tuesday and doing a connectathon with NHS Scotland and the 4 devolved nations to really, again, take that approach of getting industry in the room, starting to learn how to solve their own problems through the FHIR Terminology Services API.
Any other?
You have someone else wanted a question. Too late. You have many customers from private companies and big governmental institutions. And how do you see that the requirements differ for those who are implementing their own system and using terminology inside the system, and for those who are creating like national implementations, are more focused on authoring and distributing and maintaining the terminology?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So the biggest difference is where we've got our customers who are like national release centers, and they've got all of that requirement around maintenance and distribution and the governance to say we're the national service. It hasn't necessarily changed the requirements of the product itself, because but what it's changed is the requirements around the infrastructure that those government agencies are putting in, their policies and processes that they need to put in at that level, because it's quite different. So we've got vendors who, pretty much license the product. A couple of hours, they're really up and running because they don't have all of those requirements to think about from a security and a hosting and a performance and a policy and everything else that sits around it. But there's not been, from a support question point of view, from the product, the questions are largely the same. We don't get a lot of different in terms of the actual features of the product itself in that way. I think the biggest challenge out there is our product is a terminology server that is for implementation. We are not a content authoring product. There are some basic content authoring tools. So when you're at a government institution level, it's really about that entire tool chain that you need for terminology and content management. Whereas for some of our industry partners, really that terminology server just meets what they have from a basic need, because they get to take advantage of where the NRC has taken on all the pain, and they get to syndicate. So for anyone in a country where there's a national release center that's gone down the path of FHIR Terminology Services and syndication, really easy for those implementers to jump on board. If you're a vendor or an organization in another country where that doesn't exist, then you have to go through that process of ingesting the national content in its ways that they publish and distribute it to you. And so you've still got less pain, but still a little bit of work to do. So that's why I encourage any of you to go and convince your national organizations that if they're jumping on board with SNOMED, FHIR Terminology Services are the way to go, because it really does remove that barrier for adoption if you've got that national level, government level providing content available in that way. Then you can jump on board. And, as I said, OntoServe is just one of many. There are an open source SNOMED specific product out there, SNOMED made available by SNOMED International. There are other products, but what you really want to do is encourage your national organizations to distribute the content in that way to make it easier downstream.
So I think we've got time for one more quick question.
The question will be quick, the answer may be slow.
But I'll say it quickly.
So from a conceptual viewpoint, what I've encountered is three levels of terminology needs. One is the global terminology like SNOMED, LOINC, and ICD-10, etc.
Yeah.
The other one is the national level, which is we have our codes here and we want to manage them. And the other is at the project level. So for this specific project, we have this. In your architectural view, that's only one terminology server, that's one gateway to several terminology servers, or what is your view?
Do you want to?
I'll stand up so everyone can see me. Yeah, look, I think there isn't necessarily one answer to that, and it often depends on, it usually breaks down more along organizational lines, and who's got responsibility for what, as to how that divides up. But generally speaking, you know, you've got those big organizations running those big terminologies and publishing those. That's a job of ingesting those for whoever, whether it's an implementation organization or a national body doing that. The national level terminologies, what we find often is that all of those code systems, things exist. You know, governments publish XML files and spreadsheets and web tables and all that sort of stuff. That there's a job there to sweep all of that up and turn that into well-managed FHIR terminology resources. So not just converting it into FHIR terminology resources, but deciding how you're going to identify and version all of these things and manage those. That's where it's really good to have a national central body do that, rather than each implementer trying to figure out how to do that for themselves, and that creates a mess. And then it's really the same sort of problem when it gets down to that project level, because then they often end up with these localized code systems and things, and localized maps and things they need to manage. I think that's where it's really important to have the national bodies, or somewhere in the middle. And it could even come internationally if we could agree on some guidance to provide the guidance for the best practices on how to manage that stuff. Otherwise, it becomes chaos and the Wild West. And we've seen plenty of that too. So we try to do that in Australia. I think that some of that could get lifted up to more sort of generalized guidance that people could then take and customize.
It also comes to, I mean, a lot of that comes back to national strategy as well around. So in Australia, we wanted to drive everyone to native use of SNOMED. It can be the interface terminology. We don't have to worry about translations in Australia. So we wanted to drive people to that. So we wanted to create a reason where people found it easier to use the national terminology than actually to maintain all of their local code systems and maps that they had. So it really comes down to that strategy around where you're trying to go. And you know, it is then that path for migration, and enables people to move forward to say, well, actually, I'm going to, and this is where we're at now with a lot of our primary care systems. They all had their own local proprietary terminologies. They're now all re-platforming to software as a service. They're now saying, great, the SNOMED, I can now go there within my product. I'm building it from scratch. There's these things called FHIR Terminology Services. There's Onto Server. So I can go straight there. And we're now going to see that our vendors are going to be doing native implementation. So it really does depend, national strategy, what's happening locally, where do you want to get people to, but it actually supports at all levels.
Thank you. I do apologize. I don't mean to cut this off, but we have to prepare for the next session. One more round of applause for Kate, and thank you all so much for being there.